Lightning cracked across the dark New York skyline as Kendra Matthews stepped out of the sleek black Tesla. Little did she know that crackling sky foreshadowed a storm about to upend her life. A soft drizzle tapped on her umbrella, her fiancé's face glowing with pride as he escorted her into the elegant ballroom. Graham Rothschild, billionaire CEO of a global tech empire, couldn't imagine a more perfect night to introduce Kendra as his bride-to-be, until a single moment of prejudice shifted everything. A shadow loomed behind them, and Kendra found herself confronted by a police officer who set in motion a shocking chain of events that would stun the entire city. Kendra Matthews had always dreamed big. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Newark, she envisioned a future far brighter than her surroundings. Her mother, Nadine, worked 2 jobs as a nurse's aide at local clinics, struggling to make ends meet after Kendra's father left when she was just 7 years old. Despite the hardships, their home brimmed with warmth, laughter, and a certain unbreakable spirit. Driven by her mother's unwavering support, Kendra earned a full scholarship to Columbia University, majoring in economics. She was determined to transform her life and give back to the community that shaped her. After graduation, she founded a nonprofit initiative called Empower and Rise, dedicated to mentoring underprivileged youth. Her dedication caught the attention of media outlets, including a feature in Forbes that showcased her innovative approach to community empowerment. It was through that article that Graham Rothschild first learned of Kendra's work. Graham was no stranger to success. Born into an influential family, he had inherited a small trust from his late father and turned it into Rothschild Tech Solutions, RTS, a multi-billion-dollar corporation specializing in cutting-edge AI software. His name graced the covers of business magazines, hailing him as the new face of American entrepreneurship. But behind the glitzy facade, Graham was a man in search of substance, of true purpose. In reading Kendra's story, he saw not only a brilliant mind, but also a heart larger than any corporate empire. Months later, their worlds intersected at a charity gala Kendra had helped organize. The moment they locked eyes, sparks flew. Kendra admired Graham's humility. He was refreshingly down-to-earth, despite his staggering wealth. And Graham was enchanted by Kendra's commitment to social causes. Their conversations flowed easily from discussions of business ethics to childhood memories. A single dance at that gala ended with them exchanging numbers. And the rest, as they say, was history. In less than a year, Graham proposed to Kendra in Central Park. He meticulously planned a day that included a romantic carriage ride, followed by a candlelit picnic. As he slipped an elegant emerald-cut diamond ring onto her finger, Kendra's eyes brimming with tears, he vowed to stand by her side through any challenge life hurled their way. That promise would be tested sooner than either of them could have anticipated. Their engagement garnered significant media attention. Tabloids and TV shows ate up the rags-to-riches narrative. The altruistic, self-made woman from Newark and the billionaire mogul from one of Manhattan's most prestigious families. Some headlines were sweet, highlighting their love story. Others buzzed with cynicism, insinuating Kendra was simply after Graham's fortune. And in a world still torn by racial tension, their interracial relationship did not go unnoticed. Social media chatter ranged from celebratory applause to vitriolic comments questioning Kendra's motives. The night that would change everything was Graham's annual RTS charity ball at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan, benefiting innovative STEM education for inner-city youth. Kendra, excited to represent Empower and Rise as a beneficiary, spent the day overseeing the final event details. She wore a custom-made champagne-colored gown that shimmered under the ballroom chandeliers. Graham had never seen her look so radiant. Reporters lined the velvet ropes outside the hotel, eager to capture a photo of the philanthropic power couple. As Kendra and Graham arrived hand in hand, photographers' flashes illuminated the evening rain. The moment felt surreal until a figure broke through the crowd. "Ma'am, could you step aside?" came a stern voice. Startled, Kendra and Graham turned. Officer Peter Jensen, tall and broad-shouldered in his mid-40s, glared at Kendra with a disconcerting intensity. A hush fell across the onlookers, reporters momentarily pausing their camera flashes. Graham frowned, stepping in front of Kendra protectively. "Is there a problem, officer?" Graham asked, his voice echoing with authority. "Yes, there is," Jensen responded, lips tight. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in the area. I'm going to need to see some identification. Kendra's eyes widened. She clutched her purse, retrieving her driver's license. Is there a reason I'm being singled out? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though inside her heart pounded with a mix of confusion and indignation. The cop glanced briefly at her license, then at her face. We have reason to believe a certain suspect matching your description has been trespassing and causing disturbances around this location. Kendra looked around. This was the entrance to the Ritz-Carlton, swarming with wealthy donors, influencers, and elegantly dressed charity guests. Why would she be singled out? She was hardly the only black woman in the crowd, but Officer Jensen's eyes kept flitting over her complexion, as though that alone were enough to warrant suspicion. She's a guest here, Graham said firmly, fighting to keep his composure. In fact, she's the co-organizer of tonight's event. Perhaps you should check with hotel security. Officer Jensen narrowed his eyes, ignoring Graham's suggestion. Then, with an abruptness that left Kendra stunned, he grabbed her arm. You're coming with me, he declared. We can discuss the specifics at the station. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras started rolling. Graham lunged forward, outraged. Unhand her! He shouted, his voice thunderous. Jensen seemed unfazed. With his free hand, he twisted Kendra's arm behind her back, clicking on a pair of handcuffs. Don't resist, he hissed at her. Resisting arrest is an offense itself. But she hasn't done anything, cried a bystander, an older woman who recognized Kendra from a local news segment, praising Empower and Rise. Kendra's eyes brimmed with tears, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. I haven't done anything wrong, she stammered. Nearby, a TV reporter thrust a microphone toward the confrontation. Officer, do you have probable cause? He asked. Why are you arresting Ms. Matthews? She's a known community leader. Officer Jensen barked for everyone to stand back. This is official police business, he snapped. She matches the suspect's description. That's all you need to know. Graham turned to him, fury in every line of his face. I'm calling my lawyer. You can't treat her like this. But Jensen had already whisked Kendra away, dragging her toward a police car that screeched to a halt at the curb. The last thing Kendra saw before being shoved inside was Graham's anguished face, quickly surrounded by stunned reporters and concerned onlookers. Inside the vehicle, Kendra's heart pounded. She tried to steady herself, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs pressing into her wrists. Through the tinted windows, she could make out Graham sprinting alongside, shouting into his cell phone. It would be the longest, most terrifying car ride of her life. The police station was a stark contrast to the opulent hotel setting she just left. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The walls were a drab shade of beige, peppered with posters about community outreach and legal rights. Yet the irony of those words slapped on the station's notice board felt suffocating. Officer Jensen dragged Kendra to the booking desk, ignoring her pleas and demands for a lawyer. Around them, a few other officers looked up with mild curiosity, but no one intervened. The front desk officer typed in Kendra's information, glancing at Jensen's notes. Suspicious activity? Trespassing? The desk officer repeated, eyeing Kendra's expensive gown and immaculate presentation. If he found the charges questionable, he gave no outward sign of it. He simply printed out paperwork for her to sign. Kendra refused, demanding an attorney be present. Her voice echoed down the hallway, but no one seemed to care. Finally, she was shoved into an interrogation room. 4 walls and a single metal table with matching chairs. The door closed behind her. She exhaled a shaky breath, trying to hold herself together. She thought of her mother's gentle face, Graham's warm smile, the young students she mentored. How had a night meant to celebrate her biggest achievement turned into a nightmare of being locked away like a criminal? Time crawled. She had no way to know how many minutes or hours had passed. Then the door creaked open. Officer Jensen strode in, a cocky sneer twisting his mouth. He removed Kendra's handcuffs and sat across from her, folding his arms. You think you can just waltz around with your billionaire boyfriend and get away with anything, don't you? He spat, his voice drenched in scorn. Well, newsflash. People like me, we've seen your type before, acting all high and mighty. Kendra steadied her trembling hands. You have no cause to keep me here, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. I'm not a suspect in any real crime. We both know that. A flicker of malice lit his eyes. "I'll decide if you're a suspect or not." He pulled out a folder, likely blank or full of fabricated nonsense, Kendra suspected, and began rifling through it as though it contained vital evidence. Rising from the table, she took a deep breath. "Am I free to leave?" she asked. "Because if I am, I'm walking out that door right now." The reaction was immediate. Jensen smacked his hand on the table, standing up so fast his chair screeched. "Sit down," he growled, pointing a finger toward her. "You try to leave, I'll charge you with resisting." Kendra bit her lip, her nails digging into her palms. She had never felt so helpless in her life. Growing up, she dealt with microaggressions, had overheard racist comments at school, but never had the blatant prejudice been so close and so terrifying. This man could and would abuse his power to strip her of her rights. There was a knock on the door. A junior officer, pale-faced and nervous, peered inside. "Officer Jensen, can I talk to you for a second?" With a grunt, Jensen stepped out. Kendra caught snippets of hushed whispers. "Her fiancé is outside. Big commotion. Lawyers." Then she heard Graham's voice, muffled but unmistakably incensed. Relief flooded through her. Graham had come, and with him, no doubt, a legion of lawyers. She looked around the interrogation room again, noticing how claustrophobic it felt. The overhead light, flickering occasionally, cast a harsh glow. She thought of the young men and women she served at Empower and Rise, many of whom had recounted stories of being hassled by law enforcement just for walking down the wrong block at the wrong hour. She remembered comforting them, fighting for their rights, raising funds for legal aid. Now she was living one of those stories. Minutes ticked by. She refused to sit down, pacing the small room, mind swirling with questions. What charges would they possibly try to stick on her? Would she be detained overnight? Number Graham wouldn't let that happen, would he? Finally, the door opened again, and this time, it was not Officer Jensen who entered, but a different face, older, with a stern but measured expression. His uniform bore the insignia of a police captain. A nameplate read, "Captain Richard Alvarez." "Ms. Matthews," he said, glancing at a paper in his hand. "I'm Captain Alvarez. I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience. We've reviewed the situation, and it appears that the arrest was made in error." Kendra studied him, unsure if she could trust his words. "Error?" she echoed, voice dripping with disbelief. "He singled me out and dragged me here. What exactly was the error?" Alvarez nodded, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Officer Jensen claims he had a description of a trespassing suspect, but we've confirmed you were a registered guest at the event, and there is no evidence linking you to any wrongdoing. You're free to leave." Her eyes narrowed. "Just like that? What about the humiliation, the false arrest, the harassment?" Alvarez sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor. "We're still investigating. There will be an internal review. Please follow me so we can complete the necessary forms for your release." Though still infuriated, Kendra wanted nothing more than to see Graham and go home. She followed Alvarez out of the interrogation room, down a narrow hallway, and toward the main lobby. Her heart pounded as she saw Graham, flanked by 2 attorneys from his legal team, and their family friend, Judge Cynthia Reed, who had apparently rushed down to the precinct as soon as she heard the news. Graham's face flooded with relief the moment he saw Kendra. He rushed forward, pulling her into a tight hug, kissing the top of her head. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded stiffly, tears threatening to spill over. Alvarez stepped behind the booking desk, rummaging for the paperwork. Meanwhile, Officer Jensen lingered in a corner, visibly seething. His face betrayed a mixture of contempt and alarm. He clearly hadn't anticipated such a swift and powerful response from the Rothschild legal machine. One of Graham's lawyers, a tall woman with sharp features named Adrienne Cole, glared at Jensen. "We'll be filing a formal complaint," she said icily. "If there is any smear on Miss Matthews's record, we will be pursuing immediate legal action." Captain Alvarez attempted to smooth things over, but the tension in the room was thick. Kendra felt no relief yet, only a smoldering fury at the injustice she'd endured. She signed the release papers, her hands shaking slightly. She was free to leave physically, but the scars of the evening would stay with her. Word of Kendra's arrest spread like wildfire. Dozens of reporters who had witnessed her public arrest at the Ritz-Carlton needed no further prompting. Within hours, local news outlets and popular blogs carried headlines. Prominent philanthropist wrongfully arrested before charity gala. Billionaire's fiancé hauled off by NYPD in shocking scene. And the most damning, racial profiling at its worst, Kendra Matthews speaks out. Kendra awakened the next morning to a flood of text messages, voicemails, and social media notifications. She and Graham had barely slept, with his attorneys working late into the night drafting statements and coordinating damage control. His corporate PR team wanted to spin the narrative to highlight how swiftly Rothschild tech solutions took action on social justice issues. But Kendra wanted something more genuine than a polished corporate statement. Soon, the entire city was buzzing about the fiasco. Kendra's mother, Nadine, called in a panic from Newark. "Baby, I saw what happened on the news." "Are you all right?" she asked, voice trembling. Kendra reassured her, though she could hear in her mother's tone how devastating this was to watch. Emails poured in from supporters of Empower and Rise, so some shared their own encounters with racial profiling. Others simply offered love and encouragement. The board of directors at the nonprofit demanded an urgent meeting, worried about the negative press, but also outraged that Kendra, of all people, had been targeted. Meanwhile, Graham's phone lit up with messages from CEOs, political figures, and even celebrities who expressed their shock and support. One particularly notable message came from Serena Williams, praising Kendra's resilience and offering to help raise awareness on racial profiling. Social media erupted with hashtags like #Justice for Kendra and #Stop Racial Profiling Now. As for the NYPD, they scrambled into damage control mode. Captain Alvarez gave a terse statement to the press, claiming an internal investigation was underway. Officially, the department offered an apology to Kendra, but it was overshadowed by the widespread public outrage. Even Mayor Joseph Bradford stepped in, condemning the incident on live TV. "We cannot stand by and allow injustice like this to occur in our city," he declared. "Ms. Matthews deserves better, and we will see to it that changes are made." Yet the real tension was building behind the scenes, especially between Officer Jensen and his direct superior, Captain Alvarez. Rumors swirled that Alvarez was about to hand down some form of disciplinary action. But what Jensen did not realize was that the biggest blow was yet to come from the top levels of city leadership. 3 days after the arrest, a formal invitation arrived at Kendra's doorstep. The city's police commissioner, Roger Greenwood, personally requested to meet with her. Despite Graham's initial reluctance, he feared it might be a token gesture to quiet the scandal. Kendra agreed to go. She believed in dialogue and had always advocated for community engagement with law enforcement. If this meeting offered a chance to push for systemic reform, she would not waste it. They arrived at the Grand NYPD headquarters, a towering building on Center Street with a modest entourage. Adrian Cole and another lawyer, plus 2 board members from Empower and Rise. In the commissioner's office, large windows overlooked the bustling city. Commissioner Greenwood, a man in his late 50s with streaks of gray at his temples, stood as they entered. "Ms. Matthews, Mr. Rothschild," he greeted, extending a hand. "Thank you for meeting with me. Please have a seat." The room was adorned with plaques, commendations, and framed photographs of Greenwood at various city events. On one wall, a large poster read, "NYPD, Protecting and Serving the Community." Kendra couldn't help but feel a twinge of irony as she read the words. Greenwood began with a practiced apology. "I'm deeply sorry for the distress you experienced. Officer Jensen's actions were not representative of the NYPD's values. An internal investigation has already commenced, and I want you to know that we take this matter very seriously." Kendra studied his face, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Thank you, Commissioner," she said softly. "But this isn't about me alone. It's about the countless others who face similar or worse instances of racial profiling every day, without the resources or public platform I'm fortunate to have. We need real change, not just an apology." Graham nodded, adding, "We're prepared to support the NYPD if it's willing to implement reforms that address systemic bias and accountability." Greenwood clasped his hands on the desk. "I understand. In fact, I wanted to propose a collaboration with your organization, Ms. Matthews. Empower and rise. I've been briefed on the work you do in underprivileged communities. The department would like to work with your initiative to improve our community outreach programs, training sessions, and dialogue with local youth. Kendra's eyebrows rose. A collaboration? She had anticipated a standard PR-laden apology, maybe a donation to her organization as hush money. But an offer of collaboration from the highest levels of the police force was different and potentially game-changing. Yes, Greenwood said firmly. I want to see more constructive engagement between our officers and the communities they serve. That means training on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and forging trust. Officer Jensen's behavior reminded us we need to do better. Kendra hesitated. Could she trust that this wasn't merely a political move to salvage the NYPD's reputation? Ultimately, she decided to give it a chance, provided the commissioner allowed her real influence in shaping new policies. After a lengthy conversation outlining possible frameworks, Greenwood shifted gears. I also want to address Officer Jensen's future on the force. We can't talk about real change if people like him remain unpunished. Adrian Cole leaned forward, eyes narrowing. What do you intend to do about him? Greenwood sighed. That's part of the internal review. However, you should be aware. The police chief is furious about this incident. Jensen may be looking at termination, or worse. Depending on what the review uncovers, there might be grounds for criminal charges. A hush fell in the room. It was one thing to hear the department promise an investigation. It was another to see that they might actually be prepared to take decisive action against one of their own. For Kendra, it felt like a small but significant step toward justice. Before they left, Greenwood offered his personal line. I'm serious about this collaboration. Let's set up a preliminary workshop with your nonprofit. Real solutions require real partnerships. Kendra nodded, shaking his hand. We'll be in touch, Commissioner. As Kendra and Graham walked out of NYPD headquarters, they felt a swirl of emotions: hope, trepidation, and determination. If the department genuinely committed to reform, the fiasco of her arrest might catalyze positive change. But she also knew the road ahead would be long, complicated, and full of pushback from people like Jensen. The press conference they held outside the station a few minutes later was packed. Cameras flashed incessantly. Kendra stood at a podium flanked by Graham and Adrian. She calmly explained her ordeal, the meeting with Commissioner Greenwood, and her hopes for real reform. I don't want to be portrayed as a victim, she told the crowd. I want to be a catalyst for a broader conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. My story is just one among thousands that never see the light of day. I hope to use this platform to push for change. Graham then took the mic, condemning the outrageous actions of Officer Jensen and pledging financial support for legal funds to help others who'd been victimized by unjust arrests. The crowd ate it up. Every word soared across social media, picking up steam. Public opinion rallied behind them, while certain pockets of backlash, mainly from far-right circles, accused them of pushing an anti-police agenda. Inside the precinct, though, a storm was brewing. When Commissioner Greenwood announced his intent to collaborate with Empower and Rise, it didn't sit well with a faction of older school officers. Some believed it was pandering to political correctness. Others feared external oversight. And one man seethed more than anyone else: Officer Peter Jensen. He watched the press conference on a small TV in the break room, a half-eaten sandwich on the table in front of him. Every praise for Kendra felt like a dagger in his pride. Every call for justice sounded like a threat to his job. He'd been on the force for over 20 years. He'd survived budget cuts, departmental reorganizations, even near-fatal line-of-duty injuries. Never had he felt so powerless, so singled out. As rumors of his potential firing swirled, he paced his apartment late into the night, replaying the moment he decided to arrest Kendra. That flash of resentment he'd felt seeing a black woman stepping out of a luxury car, dripping in elegance. Had it been pure prejudice, or was it a reflex, a sense that something about the scene was off? He tried to justify himself. She looked out of place at such a lavish event. He told himself 1,000 lies to avoid confronting the truth that prejudice lay at the root of his impulsive decision. In the coming weeks, Jensen's superiors questioned him repeatedly. Each time his story changed slightly. First, he claimed there was a report about a suspicious person matching Kendra's description. Then he said hotel security had pointed her out. Both claims fell apart under scrutiny. Eventually, he retreated behind vague statements and demanded union representation. The die was cast. It was only a matter of time before the final verdict was delivered. As Kendra and Graham navigated the fallout of her arrest and the ongoing investigation, they tried not to let the stress overshadow their upcoming wedding. They had set a date for a grand celebration at the legendary Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, a homage to old New York elegance. Kendra wanted the wedding to represent unity and empowerment, planning to invite youth from her nonprofit to see that love and hope can triumph over adversity. But the press wouldn't leave them alone. Tabloid headlines alluded to the possibility of them canceling or postponing the wedding. Others claimed Kendra was using the scandal to catapult her public profile. Paparazzi hounded them whenever they stepped outside. Despite the chaos, they pressed on. Graham's mother, Eleanor Rothschild, a regal woman who once helmed an art foundation, helped with wedding arrangements. Though she had been somewhat guarded about her son's engagement, worried about the public scrutiny, the arrest incident galvanized her support. She became Kendra's fiercest defender, hosting charity brunches where she spoke passionately about confronting racial injustice. Meanwhile, Kendra dove deeper into her nonprofit work. She collaborated with Commissioner Greenwood's office on developing workshops for officers to volunteer in after-school programs. They scheduled pilot initiatives in Harlem and the Bronx, with the aim of building rapport between the NYPD and local youth. If cynics scoffed, Kendra ignored them. She believed in bridging divides, no matter how tall the wall seemed. As the wedding date approached, ebony invitations on gold-trimmed paper went out to friends, family, community leaders, and some of Graham's business associates. A-listers RSVP'd. The media dubbed it the wedding of the season. Kendra, however, just wanted a day of peace and love, away from the swirling negativity that haunted every morning's headlines. The day before the wedding, news broke that the NYPD's internal investigation had concluded. Officer Peter Jensen would face disciplinary charges, namely misconduct and falsifying an arrest report. He was suspended without pay, pending a formal departmental hearing that could lead to his termination. But the story didn't end there. Commissioner Greenwood, during a press conference, announced the results of the investigation. Flanked by Captain Alvarez, he detailed how no suspicious person reports matched Kendra's description, how Jensen had lied under oath, and how bigotry had no place in the police force. The part that truly stunned everyone was Greenwood's personal condemnation. In a forceful tone, he said, "Officer Jensen's actions not only harm Ms. Matthews, but they tarnish the reputation of the NYPD. As commissioner, I won't stand for officers who abuse their authority due to personal biases. This department has begun a rigorous process to restore public trust, and that means holding every officer, regardless of rank, fully accountable." It was a powerful statement, one that shook the entire city. In an era where many expected police departments to close ranks, Greenwood's bold stance signaled a sea change. Jensen, huddled at home, watched the press conference on TV, face pale. He heard the condemnation in the commissioner's voice, saw the flash of cameras capturing each word. The entire world seemed to stand against him. Meanwhile, across the city, social media exploded with praise for Greenwood's zero-tolerance approach. There was still skepticism. Some wondered if this was a one-off performance piece, but many saw it as a step in the right direction. At her apartment, Kendra watched the press conference on her phone, tears gathering in her eyes. She had expected the department to hush it up, maybe quietly reprimand Jensen, but seeing the commissioner publicly stand for justice gave her hope, real hope, that progress could happen. Graham, sitting beside her, gently squeezed her hand. "You see," he murmured, "your fight isn't in vain." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "I just want to live in a world where we're not judged by the color of our skin, where no one's forced to endure what I went through." He pulled her close. "One step at a time, my love, and tomorrow we'll celebrate our own union, showing everyone that love transcends all barriers." The day of the wedding dawned bright and sunny, a blessing for an outdoor ceremony in the plaza's iconic garden courtyard. Guests trickled in, elegant gowns and tailored suits forming a rainbow of fashion. Kendra wore a breathtaking off-the-shoulder white gown with intricate lace detailing. Her hair was in a crown of braids, adorned with delicate pearls. She was the embodiment of grace and resilience. Graham, nervous but thrilled, waited at the altar. A small orchestra played soft classical music, the melody drifting through the air. As Kendra walked down the aisle, arm in arm with her mother, there wasn't a dry eye among the crowd. Even the throng of paparazzi stationed at the perimeter of the courtyard seemed hushed by the sacredness of the moment. The officiant was none other than Judge Cynthia Reed, their longtime family friend. Her voice carried warmth as she spoke about love, conquering adversity, about unity in a city that often felt divided. Kendra glanced around at the gathering. Her friends from Newark, new allies from the police department, philanthropic benefactors, even celebrities. She spotted Oprah Winfrey in the crowd, who had come as a last-minute surprise guest after hearing about Kendra's story. Cameras discreetly caught Oprah dabbing tears from her eyes. At last they exchanged vows. Graham's voice trembled as he spoke of Kendra's unbreakable spirit and compassion. Kendra's voice was steady as she promised to stand beside him in every battle, in every joy. The entire plaza erupted in applause as they sealed their promises with a tender kiss. The reception was a glamorous affair inside the hotel's opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, tables decked in white roses and gold accents. Speeches were given, laughter shared, and for a precious few hours, it felt as though all the turmoil had melted away. But fate had another twist in store. As Kendra stepped outside for a quiet moment to catch her breath under the moonlight, she was startled to see someone lurking near the hotel's side entrance. It was Officer Jensen. Her heart clenched. She wore her wedding gown, a vision of purity, while he looked disheveled in civilian clothes. His eyes were bloodshot, face drawn. "You ruined my life," he rasped, bitterness dripping from each word. Kendra's pulse pounded. She glanced around, but no security guard was in immediate sight. She took a breath, remembering her vow to always stand up for what was right, and faced him. "No, Officer Jensen, you ruined your own life when you chose to arrest me without cause." He stepped forward, fists clenched at his sides. "You've turned the whole department against me. The city, the media, my own family can't look me in the eye." Fear pricked at Kendra's spine, but she didn't back down. "You did that to yourself. All I ever did was show the world what happened. If you can't own up to your prejudice, that's on you." His mouth twisted in anger. It looked like he might lunge at her. Suddenly, security guards rounded the corner, alerted by a passerby who recognized Jensen. The ex-cop stepped back. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then he turned on his heel and fled into the darkness, leaving Kendra shaken yet resolute. She returned to the reception, forcing a smile as she rejoined Graham. For the rest of the evening, she told no one what happened, not wanting to mar the joyous occasion, but inwardly she felt rattled. The confrontation was a reminder that bigotry rarely vanishes quietly. It fights back, clinging to denial. The fallout from Kendra's wrongful arrest sparked citywide outrage, but the real reckoning for Officer Peter Jensen began the day he was formally brought before an internal disciplinary panel. Months had passed since that fateful night at the Ritz-Carlton. During that time, Jensen's life had been unraveling in slow motion. Strained finances from an unpaid suspension, friends on the force turning cold or outright hostile, and a wife who was increasingly disturbed by the man she'd married. He tried to brush off his growing isolation as a witch hunt, but deep down, he sensed his entire world was teetering on the brink of collapse. The departmental hearing took place in a somber conference room at NYPD headquarters. A long table sat at the center, a panel of 3 senior officers and 2 civilian representatives arranged in a row. Jensen faced them from a smaller table, seated beside a union-appointed defense lawyer who appeared half-resigned to the outcome. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, casting a stark glare on the polished floors. Outside, a cluster of reporters huddled, microphones raised, ready to pounce on every detail. The city that once looked at Jensen as just another uniformed cop now knew him as the face of blatant racial profiling. Each article, each TV segment, had built up to this moment. Would there be genuine accountability? When the proceedings opened, Captain Richard Alvarez provided a factual timeline of events. He described the night of the arrest, how Kendra had arrived at a high-profile charity gala, was singled out and handcuffed without reasonable cause, and dragged to the precinct in full view of the media. He laid out how Jensen allegedly fabricated a suspect description that never actually existed, claiming it matched Kendra, and then doubled down on his story under oath. Each sentence struck like a hammer blow. Jensen sat rigid, arms folded, occasionally shooting accusatory glares at Alvarez. Meanwhile, his lawyer tried to interrupt the captain's testimony multiple times, complaining about hearsay and media bias, but the panel allowed Captain Alvarez to finish. Next, a representative from the Civilian Review Board presented a meticulously compiled dossier. It included hotel security footage showing Jensen pointing Kendra out in the crowd, with no one else resembling her in the vicinity. Witness statements from guests, reporters, and bystanders who saw the arrest unfold and confirmed that no prior disturbance had taken place. Radio transmissions, or lack thereof, from Jensen to dispatch. There was no recorded call that he had spotted a suspect or needed backup for a reported crime. This, the board noted, contradicted Jensen's claims of receiving urgent radio intel on a trespasser. Kendra's own recorded deposition played on a large monitor. Though she wasn't physically present in the room that day, her lawyers wisely chose to limit the emotional toll. The video was enough to make everyone watch in tense silence. Dressed in a simple blouse, Kendra calmly recalled the humiliating experience, her voice steady but her eyes heavy with remembered pain. "This wasn't just an isolated bad decision," she said in the footage. "It was the product of prejudice. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking accountability. For me and for every person who doesn't have a billionaire's lawyer on speed dial." As the evidence piled up, Jensen's defense strategy wavered. Initially, his lawyer insisted Jensen had been acting on credible information regarding a trespasser with a similar build and outfit. But under questioning, inconsistencies emerged. No official call logs matched Jensen's timeline. No suspicious person bulletins existed that night for the Ritz-Carlton. The lawyer tried pivoting to portray Jensen as an officer under stress, forced to make a split-second decision in a tense environment. Yet every angle they tried fell flat under scrutiny. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier when Jensen took the stand. He appeared visibly tense, glancing repeatedly at the panel as though searching for sympathy. He spoke about his long service in the NYPD, the commendations he'd once received for bravery, and the pressure he felt to maintain security at a high-profile event. "I made a call based on what I believed were legitimate concerns," he said, voice cracking with a mixture of desperation and anger. "Could I have handled it better? Maybe. But I've dedicated my life to this city. I don't deserve to be crucified." He avoided directly answering questions about racial bias or the contradictory radio logs. Instead, he tried to pivot blame onto a media frenzy that had painted him as a villain before any facts were established. But each time the panel pressed him for concrete evidence, Jensen floundered, offering only vague responses that clashed with the overwhelming documentation. By midday, everyone adjourned for lunch. Jensen sat alone in a corner, nibbling a cold sandwich while his lawyer paced the hallway, phone glued to his ear. The hush that enveloped them spoke volumes. Even the union lawyer seemed to realize there was little chance of saving Jensen from a harsh verdict. Outside the conference room, the corridors bustled with anxious energy. Community activists, NYPD officers, and ordinary citizens milled around, discussing the hearing's significance. Some worried that a slap on the wrist would signal that the department's promise of reform was hollow. Others felt relief that, for once, an officer's misconduct wasn't being swept under the rug. A journalist from a major TV network set up an impromptu interview area. One by one, figures in suits and uniforms offered brief statements. Opinions ranged from full-throated condemnation to cautious neutrality. One young officer, fresh out of the academy, admitted quietly that the Jensen case had shaken his view of his profession. "I thought the badge stood for equality," he said, eyes downcast. "But now I see how a few bad acts can cast doubt on all of us. I want the department to do the right thing." After lunch, the hearing reconvened with a bombshell. Prosecutors from the department advocate's office presented newly discovered text messages. Sent on the very night of Kendra's arrest, these messages, retrieved from Jensen's police phone, revealed explicit racial slurs, and callous jokes about rich black folks trying to play princess at fancy events. The moment the panel saw those messages, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Even the union lawyer's face fell, as though he'd been blindsided. "Officer Jensen, can you explain these texts?" asked Major Lauren Reeves, one of the panel's top investigators. Jensen's complexion turned gray. He stammered out a disjointed denial, claiming he didn't remember sending them, that someone else could have used his phone. But the log showed timestamps matching his shift, and the language was undeniably personal. The hearing room crackled with tension. When pressed for further explanation, Jensen lashed out. "This is a setup. She's using her billionaire fiancé to dig up dirt, to ruin me. It's a conspiracy." Major Reeves cut him off, her voice turning steely. "Officer Jensen, that's enough. The evidence is clear. Please respect these proceedings." Shaken, Jensen sank back into his seat, beads of sweat dotting his brow. Everyone else in the room understood that this was the final nail in his coffin. On the hearing's last day, the panel delivered its ruling. Jensen was found guilty of multiple violations, including falsifying an arrest report, racial discrimination, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The recommendation was unambiguous: immediate termination from the NYPD with no possibility of a severance package, plus a referral for potential criminal charges related to lying under oath and tampering with evidence. In a final statement read by Captain Alvarez, the department declared, "Officer Jensen's actions not only violate the standards of law enforcement, but they undermine the very trust the NYPD pledges to uphold. We cannot tolerate prejudice or abuse of power within our ranks." A hush settled over the small crowd as Jensen stood, his union lawyer by his side, face devoid of color. He tried to speak, perhaps to protest or plead, but the words stuck in his throat. The next moments felt surreal as security personnel escorted him from the conference room. Reporters clamored outside, their cameras capturing every inch of his defeat. But the worst was yet to come for Jensen. Because just as he stepped through the doors, hoping to slip away, the district attorney's office issued a press release confirming it would review criminal charges. The media descended, microphones thrust into Jensen's face, bright lights exposing his panic. "Officer Jensen, how do you feel about being fired? Will you fight to keep your pension?" one journalist shouted. "Is it true you use racial slurs?" asked another, as the sea of voices grew louder, pressing in on him. He had no answer. His eyes flickered with anger, shame, and fear, but there was nowhere left to run. In the days that followed, local news channels replayed clips of Jensen's hearing. The newly leaked text messages circulated online, inciting fresh waves of outrage. Public sentiment was unrelenting. Even moderate commentators, typically cautious in police controversies, insisted that Jensen's termination signaled a necessary victory against systemic prejudice. Some activists saw it as proof that departmental reform might actually be possible if community pressure remained strong. Meanwhile, in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, Jensen watched it all unfold on a flickering television. His wife had moved out 2 weeks prior, leaving behind a terse note. "I didn't sign up for this." Friends stopped answering his calls. A once respected officer with 2 decades of service was reduced to a pariah. Desperate for a semblance of redemption, he agreed to an interview with a minor cable network. The producer promised him a chance to tell his side of the story. Jensen, clinging to the faint hope that he could sway public opinion, arrived in a rumpled suit and sat in a brightly lit studio. He reiterated his claims of a grand conspiracy, blaming liberal elites and race card politics. But mid-interview, the host confronted him with the leaked text messages. Jensen's face went slack, and he stammered incoherent excuses. The broadcast cut to commercial, but the damage was done. What little sympathy he might have retained vanished in a hail of condemnation. For the NYPD, the ruling against Jensen was a statement that no officer was untouchable. Commissioner Greenwood praised the panel's decision and reiterated that the department still had a long way to go in mending public trust. Kendra's case, as painful as it was, became a rallying cry for new training programs and oversight policies. An example of how one person's courage could catalyze meaningful steps toward justice. For Kendra, learning of Jensen's final downfall stirred complex emotions. She had never sought personal vengeance, only accountability. Yet seeing the raw consequences of his actions filled her with a somber relief. At least now, there was a clear message that blatant racism and abuse of power would not be swept aside without repercussions. In the end, Jensen's hard crash was, in many ways, a microcosm of a larger shift. A reminder to those wearing the badge that they served a diverse city, watching their every move, and that in an age of viral videos and public scrutiny, the system's protection had its limits. It was a reckoning not just for Jensen, but for all who believed they could act without conscience and remain immune. From that point forward, his name faded into the background, another symbol of a broken past. But for Kendra, Graham, and countless others who'd rallied for change, this chapter of hard-fought justice would forever stand as proof. Sometimes karma arrives in the form of long-overdue accountability, crashing down like a thunderbolt on those who believe themselves untouchable. While Jensen's downfall played out in public, Kendra and Graham kept moving forward. The pilot workshops between Empower and Rise and the NYPD launched in 3 boroughs, each session attended by local youths and a handful of community-minded officers. They spoke openly about fears, expectations, and the need for respect on all sides. Early feedback was promising. City leaders hailed Kendra as a pioneer in forging better police-community relations. She was invited to speak at town halls and city councils. Donations poured into Empower and Rise, allowing them to expand their staff and scope. Even Hilton Hotels reached out to collaborate on a scholarship fund for community college students pursuing criminal justice degrees focused on restorative policing. In the midst of this work, Kendra and Graham found time for happiness, building a life together in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Their wedding photos graced the pages of the society magazines, but that was just a footnote to the broader legacy they were creating, one of justice, understanding, and hope. With the settlement money from the city, which Kendra had pursued not for personal gain, but to reinforce a precedent, she built a new community center in Newark. It included a legal aid clinic and a job training program aimed at helping young adults find stable, fulfilling careers. When reporters asked why she dedicated the funds to Newark rather than to herself, she answered simply, "This was never about me. It was about all of us." Months turned into a year. The scandal over Kendra's wrongful arrest gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories vying for the city's attention. But the reforms Kendra had helped spur remained in motion. The partnership between Empower and Rise and the NYPD continued to flourish. Captain Alvarez oversaw expansions of the program, integrating cultural sensitivity training into the standard curriculum for cadets. Graham continued to helm Rothschild Tech Solutions, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He sponsored advanced technological tools to aid responsible policing, including body cameras and AI that flag suspicious policing patterns. Critics pointed out the challenges of privacy and bias in AI, but Graham insisted that technology, when guided by ethics, could help hold officers accountable. Throughout the city, small but meaningful shifts took root. Community leaders, once distrustful of the police, found channels to voice concerns. NYPD officers saw the benefits of building genuine relationships with residents. The transformation was far from complete. Racism and abuse of power still lurked in corners, but progress was tangible. For Kendra and Graham, life settled into a new rhythm. They learned to juggle philanthropic initiatives, corporate responsibilities, and their marriage. And although they sometimes faced new controversies, business competitors, tabloids speculating about a pregnancy, it paled in comparison to the storm that had once threatened to tear their world apart. On a balmy summer evening, 1 year after that fateful arrest, Kendra stood on a stage at a community festival in Harlem. She introduced a group of teenagers who had trained in a new youth police dialogue program, watching proudly as they spoke about their experiences. Beside her sat Commissioner Greenwood, smiling encouragingly. As the crowd cheered for these young voices of change, Kendra felt a warmth radiate in her chest. She glanced at Graham in the front row, his eyes shining with admiration, and reflected on how far they had come. From a horrifying night at the Ritz-Carlton, through injustice and heartbreak, all the way to a moment of tangible progress. Their love, tested by adversity, had grown stronger, and together they had forged a testament. that sometimes out of our darkest trials, the brightest futures can arise. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through hope, heartbreak, and transformation. Kendra and Graham's story shows how love and perseverance can overcome even the darkest storms, and how a single act of courage can spark change in an entire system. If this tale resonated with you, let it serve as a reminder that none of us are powerless. One voice can make waves, and one heart can ignite real, lasting reform. If you enjoyed this video and believe in spreading messages of unity and resilience, make sure to hit the like button, share the story with friends, family, or anyone who needs a spark of inspiration. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more riveting, heartfelt stories. Together, let's keep shining a spotlight on the power of empathy and justice, building bridges instead of walls. Thank you for watching.